When I was a little girl in the 1930s, a trip by automobile to visit my maternal grandmother Susan Bowen seemed to take hours, though it was probably not more than 25 miles or so from our southeast Portland house to Tualatin. Bouncing along in our black model Ford sedan, we crossed the Willamette River, passed through part of the downtown district, then headed southwest on Pacific Highway. After crossing the lazy Tualatin River, we turned left on a country road flanked by filbert orchards and strawberry fields, passing a few farmhouses with healthy vegetable gardens flourishing in the fertile river bottom soil. Where Post Road ended at the Tualatin Country Club Road, which followed the railroad tracks, we stopped. This corner acre of Tualatin with a white bungalow facing Country Club Road was my grandma's beloved home. Grandpa Bowen had been restless, first seeking homestead land to farm after they left Missouri, then searching for a better job, or any job. He had moved his family to Denver, Colorado from one rented house to another, finally renting a new house in southeast Portland in the early 20s. About 1928, before Grandpa died of a stroke in August of 1929, Grandma's children decided she needed to enjoy a home of her own. Finally, the Tualatin property was purchased because Grandma had been raised on a farm in Versailles, Missouri, and loved living in the country. One son, Lester, whose birth name was Charles Lester, and his wife Bertha lived down the road a piece, as Grandma Susan would say it. Grandma's house was built by her daughter Sadie's husband, George Erickson, and Grandma's three sons, Oscar, Lester, and Jewel, who Grandma still called her boys, when they were 60 and 70 years old. During the Depression years, with families of their own to support, none of them could afford the money for building materials to complete her house, so it remained unfinished inside during some of my childhood. Yet anyone watching Grandma in her garden realized that the outdoors was probably more important to her than the indoors. Around Grandma Susan's house there were more flowers and flowering bushes than there was lawn. I remember walking down the path leading away from her back steps, sniffing fragrant lavender plants, lilac bushes, and tiny violets. Deep pink roses climbed a trellis hiding one side of the woodshed near the house. Next to the roses bloomed bright red geraniums in a flower box on the ground. Surrounding the house, everywhere I looked, perennials merrily mingled in rainbow colors, creating a spreading, old-fashioned garden. In the spring, tulips, daffodils, and narcissus popped out of the ground in unexpected places, announcing the end of winter, and later purple iris, orange oriental poppies, dainty cosmos, and golden black-eyed Susans bloomed beside tall hollyhock and roses. Every time I see black-eyed Susans blooming, I think of Grandma Susan's garden. Before Grandma had the luxury of piped water and a hose, she kept her vegetable garden and flowers healthy by carrying a large, galvanized sprinkling can or pails of water to them from her porch pump. In August and September she prepared and preserved fruit and vegetables in quantity, enough for her family of 5 children years after she no longer had them at home. Her garden and canning was a joy for Grandma, probably keeping her legs going and her heart pumping into her 80s. However, it became a nuisance for her 2 daughters when they were in their 50s and 60s with less energy than earlier. I recall the hours they spent dumping spoiled jars of fruit that had been in the cellar too long. Yet they knew their mother would continue canning more next year, just as her mother and her mother's mother had done. Many days when our car stopped at Grandma's property, we saw this dear little lady bent over her hoe in the back garden, a fresh apron protecting her dress, a calico handmade sunbonnet, or an old straw hat shading her face from the sun. Looking up from her precious vegetables she had been weeding, Grandma would see us walking toward the house and come running with a big smile, her brown eyes twinkling. Nothing pleased Grandma more than a visit from some of her family. "Well, well, what a nice surprise," she would say. "Come on in and sit a spell." Sometimes we stopped at the pump on the back porch for a cold drink of delicious well water. I loved to prime the old creaky pump and watch for that sudden gush of water as I pushed down once more on the handle. As the water began to flow, it required every bit of strength in a child's arms and back muscles. Drinking too much of that good water might require a walk to the outhouse, though. And having to pass those dreaded chickens, clucking, pecking creatures with staring eyes and sharp, menacing beaks. I was especially fearful of the ones who had escaped the chicken coop and stood on that narrow dirt path defying me to pass. I rejoiced when indoor plumbing was installed at Grandma's house. I wondered what one of those chickens had done to upset Grandma one day when I saw her chasing the frantic, running, flapping bird. I was shocked to see my kindly grandmother quickly grab it, make a stop at the chopping block by the woodshed, then enter the kitchen dangling a headless chicken from her hand. Before this event, it hadn't occurred to me that those platters of delicious fried chicken which we enjoyed had required that Grandma become a killer. I watched with fascination as she poured boiling water from a tea kettle over the brown bird, then pulled out the feathers and singed any remaining pin feathers with the flame of a candle before cutting it into pieces for frying, and all by the light of a kerosene lamp. The next day I watched Grandma lightly roll biscuit dough with her experienced hands, shell green peas, skillfully cut homemade noodles on a floured board, and make loganberry pies from her vines. Occasionally she baked a cake instead, usually lemon-flavored and frosted with 7-minute icing, drenched with shredded coconut. Preparing such a feast took considerably more time than heating a TV dinner, so I'd run outside to swing in her bench swing as Grandma called after me, "Don't slam the screen door." But always it was too late. Sometimes when my cousin Norma was there, we opened the heavy lid of Grandma's tall, mahogany Victrola, selected some records from the partitioned cabinet section, and cranked it up. "Beautiful Ohio" was sung by a vibrato tenor. I wonder if all male recording artists were tenors in the early days, or if old recording methods raised their voices to a higher pitch. I recall the singer's voice, drifting with the current down a moonlit stream. "Beautiful Ohio, in dreams again. I see visions of what used to be." Another record featured a voice like a cartoon character narrating Casey up to bat. But when our laughter became too much for Grandma, she called out, "That's enough noise, girlies. It makes me nervous." Her daughters were her girls, and her granddaughters were her girlies. I can see that living room clearly. Grandma's white wicker plant stand stood under one living room window and held several plants, all looking healthier than mine do. The bright pink blooms of Christmas cactus trailed over the edge of the wicker container. Nearby, two carved, antique rocking chairs sat in the dining room archway where I often rocked and studied Grandma's pictures around the room. One table was crowded with pictures of her many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. To the right she had hung the loveliest colored portrait I'd ever seen in a large gold oval frame. I think it was Grandma Susan's sky-blue taffeta dress, floor-length, which attracted me. She stood at the side of her husband Will, who sat solemnly holding precious little Harry, their firstborn, beloved Harry, who was to die at only 2 years of age. On the opposite wall was a brown-tone photograph of Grandpa George William Bowen with his police squadron in Denver. Standing tall in the center of the back row, he was handsome with wavy brown hair and a big mustache, with shiny stars decorating their brass-buttoned uniforms and wearing tall London bobby hats. They held nightsticks at their sides while posing with serious expressions. I loved to gaze into Grandma's china closet. Especially beautiful was a dessert bowl with smaller dishes in ruby red cut glass with gold flowers and trim shaped like inverted scalloped crowns. A lovely pitcher with matching glasses featured raised, rose-colored cherries and golden leaves. I recall a little white sack of lemon drops in the back corner of one shelf. Quickly I popped one into my mouth and tiptoed across the colorful rag rug and out the front door. A few yards beyond the road in front of Grandma's house were the railroad tracks where once or twice a day a freight train roared by. I liked to wave at the engineer, who always waved back, but when Grandma called, Come, I reckon it's time to eat." We gathered around her oval oak table for a home-cooked meal guaranteed to please. As we ate, I studied the ornate oak sideboard with traditional oval mirror in the center surrounded by carved garlands. Rounded shelves on each side of the mirror displayed more of Grandma's treasured vases and bric-a-brac, which she had packed and moved from house to house. Before electricity was installed in her house, I watched Grandma light the wicks in her kerosene lamps after supper. One lamp was a pale green formed of marbled, opaque glass and decorated with a lovely pink rose. Cheery lamplight created giant shadows on her pink walls, giant shadows that moved when we walked about. Grandma had pink building paper walls until Uncle George plastered the house. As we sat together in the living room, Mother and Grandma exchanged stories of everyday experiences that had happened since they had been together. Grandma used little expressions that I suppose came from her growing up years in the 1870s in Missouri. She would say, "On Monday methinks I'd better go up the road and see how the Burtons are doing." When hearing about something sad, Grandma would say, "Mercy," or "Tisk, tisk, tiske" with her tongue. When we stayed at Grandma's overnight, Dad drove back to Portland so that he could work that night at the post office. Mother and I shared Grandma's feather bed, sleeping cozily and soundly, while Grandma slept in a spare room. In the morning, I awoke to the aroma of coffee, bacon, and Grandma's biscuits baking in the oven of her iron wood range decorated with chrome trim. Grandma had started her day early, as usual, pumping water and splitting wood into kindling. I relished those delicious breakfasts with hot food taken from warming compartments at the top of the range after we were seated at the table. Grandma served bacon and eggs, homemade applesauce, and her tender biscuits with prune butter or gooseberry jam. When Dad came back to get Mother and me in the afternoon, Grandma always carried on about us not staying long enough. As we drove away, Grandma stood beside her rose arbor near the road and waved goodbye with a dish towel or apron in her hand until we disappeared from sight. Waving from the back window of our Model A Ford as we drove away, I felt sad to leave her there alone. Despite all of Grandma's ambitious gardening, chopping wood, cooking, and cleaning, whenever anybody asked her, "How have you been?" she dropped her head and said in a soft voice, "Not very good." Yet I don't remember Grandma sick in bed for one whole day during her years in Tualatin until she was near 90. She lived alone until she was 92, with help from my mother and Aunt Sadie with thorough house cleaning from the time Grandma was about 65. Her response of "not so good" when asked how she had been feeling possibly came from her loneliness, for this sturdy little lady kept on maintaining her garden and canning until she was 90. She loved her home and garden and refused to move when her daughters said, "Mama, you're having little strokes. You must not live here any longer." Grandma always answered, "Not now, girls. I can't talk about it right now. I have to lie down." When Grandma reached 92, Aunt Sadie moved her into a cute little house on her property on Southwest Rogers Road. This property in the 1990s became part of a new neighborhood of nice homes built near the Mormon temple, so the older homes were torn down in the process. But in 1965 or 1966, Aunt Sadie had hired a carpenter to make a large garage into 3 rooms, which Aunt Sadie painted and decorated so that Grandma could have her own little home next door to her daughter. Aunt Sadie moved a slip or portion of many plants and flowers from her Tualatin home, including her rock garden made of rocks she collected on trips. In less than 2 years, however, Grandma had to move into Aunt Sadie's house, where Sadie nursed her until she died at 96 years old. Grandma Susan Sheckler Bowen died on Mother's Day, May 10, 1970. 6 of her great-grandsons bore her casket to its site in the Little Winona Cemetery in Tualatin, Oregon, only about a mile from where she had lived. It's sad now to drive past the corner where her house, yard, and flowers had been, and to see a modern municipal building erected on the spot. I want to close my eyes and imagine her flowers and vegetable garden, with dear Grandma Susan standing by the road waving goodbye to us and smiling sweetly.